Good evening, Hao. It's Danny Dhaiphong, your host. We are live. Please do hit the like button as we get started here today. We have a huge show for you today with very special guests. And before we get to them, we have to really break in what is going on, break what is happening. I woke up this morning to Western and Israeli media panic that a Yemeni ballistic missile had struck near Israel's Ben Gurion airport, causing 8 casualties and bypassing both the U.S. supplied THAAD system and Israel's Arrow 3 air defense systems worth billions of U.S. dollars. Now, Yemen's Ansar Allah has declared a full aerial blockade on Israel, and international airlines such as Delta, Lufthansa, and many others have suspended operations. The truth is that Yemen's stand for Gaza, which is what this is, has been hugely significant over the past 15 plus months, not just for Israel, but for the US's unipolar world order, which Israel is a part. The US empire is increasingly fragile, and we see this as China accelerates de-dollarization, as well as Russia, and that no amount of Trump's greenlighting of more air defense systems for Ukraine can stop the tide of Russian victory in the Ukraine conflict. The empire not only has no clothes, it is out of cards. To break all of this down, we have two very special guests today. We have Benjamin Norton of the Geopolitical Economy Report. He is the host of Geopolitical Economy Report. Ben, thanks so much for joining again.
Thanks for having me, Danny. It's always a pleasure.
Yes, and then we have KJ Noh. He's the host of the China Report on Breakthrough News, a geopolitical analyst and journalist. Thank you, KJ, for joining me again today. How are you?
I'm doing well. Good to be with you.
Yes, yes. Well, I wanted to first get your reactions to what everyone has been talking about over the past 24 hours or so. CNN talked about how Israel's air defense systems, many of which supplied by the United States, failed to intercept this Ansar Allah missile that targeted the airport and caused significant damage, including 8 casualties. Now, I just want to pull up, before I get your reaction maybe to this, Ben, the crater. It was massive. I think it's measured to be 25 meters long, and I'm just going to show an image of this just to drive home the point of what has happened here. So here is a video, and I'm just going to fast forward a bit to the crater. So, Ben, talk about the significance of this, especially in light of the fact that the United States, as we move into this multipolar world, has been targeting Yemen hard with 800 plus airstrikes, and yet this happens. Your reaction?
Well, the Yemeni leadership in the government where the majority of the Yemeni population lives in the north, it's called in the west the Houthis. It's not the official name. The official name is Ansar Allah. In response to this attack on Israel, they said that they will stop attacking Israel when Israel stops committing genocide against the Palestinian people in Gaza. And this has been the explicitly stated demand of the Yemeni leadership since October 2023. And that part is conveniently ignored in much of the debate about Yemen. And it's the most important part. You can't understand. Israel says these are terrorists who are attacking us because they hate freedom or whatever nonsense, this Bush era war on terror nonsense. But in reality, Yemen is carrying out an act of humanitarian intervention. The US for decades has used this lie, claiming that its military intervention is for humanitarian reasons. Well, here we have an actual case of an ongoing genocide sponsored by the US in Gaza being carried out by Israel. Israel is being investigated by the International Court of Justice. There's an open case. Judges at the ICJ at The Hague, they ruled that Israel can be investigated on plausible charges of genocide. Many countries have joined this case that was started by South Africa. Many countries in the global south have joined. And meanwhile, top experts at the United Nations have repeatedly said that Israel is committing genocide. The UN created a commission to investigate Israel's crimes in Gaza, and they also stated, this UN body stated, that Israel is committing genocide. And the people of Yemen, which is the poorest country in the region, have stood up. They're one of the only countries in the region that has fought for the Palestinians. The richest countries in the region, like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, they've done nothing to help the Palestinians. In fact, on the contrary, Saudi Arabia is invested in Israel's illegal colonization of Palestinian land in Israeli settlements. In Trump's first term, his Israel policy was overseen by his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who is married to Trump's daughter. Jared Kushner is also a multimillionaire real estate mogul like Trump. And Jared Kushner, just a few months after leaving the White House during Trump's first term, he created an investment fund, and the Saudi monarchy gave his investment fund billions of dollars from Saudi Arabia's sovereign wealth fund to invest in specifically Israeli assets, and in particular, in an Israeli company that profits from illegal settlements in Palestine. So the richest countries in West Asia that have all of this oil money are actually helping Israel. They're invested in Israel. They're helping it colonize Palestine, doing nothing to support the Palestinian people. Meanwhile, the people in the poorest country in the region, Yemen, that were also victims of a horrific war carried out by Saudi Arabia with US backing for nearly a decade, that killed hundreds of thousands of Yemenis using disease and hunger as a weapon. They have stood up and have been fighting in defense of the Palestinian people. So all of that context is very important to understand why Yemen attacked Israel. It was not because they just wanted to go out of their way to kill Israelis and attack civilians. No, this was part of a war that has been going on. Yemen has been part of a US-Israeli war, and there are some other resistance forces in the region that are also involved in this war. But of course, most of the governments in the region are just obediently going to do what the US tells them, and they're afraid of Israel. And the fact that the poorest country was able to stand up to Israel shows that at the end of the day, you know, Israel is a paper tiger.
Yeah, and KJ, it's this is escalating because, as Ben said, this is all about Gaza, and Yemen has said this is the reason why Ansar Allah is doing this. They said directly that it's because Israel is escalating. Israel's on the offensive in Gaza as we speak, accelerating and increasing the scale and scope of its genocide. So your thoughts on this, because Ben said this is the weakest, so-called weakest, poorest, we should say, really, because it actually is maybe one of the strongest, but the poorest country in the world is able to do this with what appears to be a hypersonic ballistic missile that traveled 1,200 kilometers across Yemen into Israel.
Well, I think it's important to highlight that not only did it traverse 1,200 kilometers, but it went through 4 layers of what are supposedly impenetrable air defense systems, including the Arrow system and the, billion-dollar THAAD system. So I think this has punctured a hole in the Israeli sense of impunity, that it has, these powerful defenses. It's like wearing huge, powerful body armor, and then it goes out and bullies all of its neighbors. And this has literally punctured a hole in that. Right now, they're claiming that it was some kind of technical failure and that they detected everything. But once again, as I said, it went through 4 layers of air defense. This is the kind of thing that is not supposed to happen. I was on earlier today regarding, the liberation of Saigon and the reunification of Vietnam. And just before that, during the Paris peace talks, Richard Nixon unrolled this military operation Linebacker 2. And again, the B-52s were supposed to have total and complete air dominance along with its support system, and multiple B-52s were shot down. That was a huge crushing blow to U.S. confidence, and they claimed that this forced the Vietnamese to the table. But actually, if the U.S. had been successful, it itself would not have gone to the table. I think This is a similar situation. I think the US and the Israelis are going to have to reckon with the fact that they are not the invincible bullies that they once were. And I think there's, thousands of reserves are going to be called up, and there's going to be, a massive escalation. But at the end of the day, there's only so much you can do when your foundational source of force projection has been shown to be wanting.
Yeah, well, Ben, Israel is saying they're going to, Netanyahu said in his own words, it's not going to be just a single bang in response to what Yemen just said. It's going to be many bangs. But isn't that what's been going on in Yemen for a while now? The United States, many reports are saying not only has there been 800 plus strikes, but there's been just hundreds upon hundreds. We don't even know the casualty count, the murdered in Yemen. What's going to change with Israel saying they're going to go in with their air force? Your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, Yemen is a country that has been a victim of Western wars for decades, really since 9/11. It was one of the first countries to be targeted by U.S. drone strikes in the so-called war on terror. And the so-called Houthis, that's this derogatory name used by the West, they're actually called Ansar Allah. Their origins are, in fact, in the indigenous resistance forces in Yemen after the U.S. invasion of Iraq. They were also resisting Saudi Arabia's Wahhabi influence. With U.S. support, Saudi Arabia was spreading its very extreme, distorted form of Sunni Islam in the region, which led to the spread of groups like Al-Qaeda, which shared a very similar extremist ideology to the Saudi monarchy. And in Yemen, the Ansar Allah movement was based in a small Shia sect, and they were resisting Saudi Wahhabi influence, and also the Ansar Allah grew as a movement with this anti-imperialist spirit in response to the U.S. invasion of Iraq. And there's been this very sectarian narrative about Ansar Allah, largely because they're Shia, even though the jurisprudence of the Shia in Yemen is actually more similar to Sunnis. But anyway, there's a sectarian narrative, which is another reason you see this propaganda. Every time the Western media talks about the so-called Houthis, they always say Iran-backed. They never say U.S.-backed Israel, U.S.-backed Saudi Arabia, or Gulf monarchy-backed Al-Qaeda, because we know that Al-Qaeda was backed by them. But anyway, Hillary Clinton admitted that in a document that was released by WikiLeaks, that the U.S. knew that Saudi Arabia was supporting Al-Qaeda. But anyway, getting back to Ansar Allah. So this group emerged in Yemen indigenously. They're not an Iranian proxy. They're allies with Iran, but they're not a proxy of Iran. And as they grew in influence, they took over more territory. And in 2014, in September, they had a revolution. They took over the central government in Sana'a, the capital of Yemen, in a revolution. And the government that they overthrew was a US-backed puppet dictatorship. It was not a so-called democracy, which is the narrative you hear now. And they had a kind of nationalist revolution with an Islamic orientation. Ansar Allah is very similar to Hezbollah in Lebanon, a kind of Islamic-oriented national liberation movement, third world nationalist movement. And in response to their revolution in September of 2014, in March of 2015, Saudi Arabia, backed by the US and the UK and France, launched this brutal war on Yemen. They bombed Yemen for nearly a decade. Technically, the war never ended. There was a kind of de facto ceasefire, but the Trump administration recontinued. They relaunched this war that's been going on now for a decade. And Trump's constantly posting on social media about how he's bombing all these areas, including civilian homes in Yemen. And they say, oh, there's a senior member of Ansar Allah who's with his family, so they'll just kill the entire family. So it shows that what Israel does in Gaza is exactly what the U.S. does as well. This is not an accident. This is the intentional strategy, is liquidating entire families, is killing 10 civilians so they can kill one militant. And once again, I need to stress that it's amazing that the people of Yemen have been standing up despite the fact that they're the poorest country in West Asia. They don't have as many resources, but they've shown what it's like to be principled and to oppose genocide. Whereas, again, This is about genocide. The U.S. wants to make everything about Yemen and this group and Iran. This is about Israel's ongoing genocide. What is Israel's excuse? They agreed to a ceasefire, and then Israel unilaterally violated the ceasefire and has continued bombing Gaza and has continued colonizing the West Bank and destroying civilian homes and ethnically cleansing Palestinians. They have no excuse anymore. This is a genocide, and the people of Yemen have stood up, and everything needs to be centered around that.
Yeah, KJ, do you want to anything you want to add there?
Absolutely. I think Ben is absolutely correct. We have to center it around the moral stance of the Houthis in trying to prevent an ongoing genocide. But, once again, I also want to highlight the fact that this has foundationally punctured a hole in both Israeli and US sense of their impunity and omnipotence. Remember, there are only 7 THAAD missile batteries in the world. And in October of last year, or at October of 2024, the US sent a THAAD battery to Israel to shore up its capacity to exert and continue to bully. And the fact that the THAAD system has been shown to be helpless against the Ansar Allah, I think really, really shows how far US military power has degraded. And also the incredible cost asymmetries that are involved. A single THAAD missile is about $12 million. Who knows what the Houthis are paying, but certainly it's not $12 million per missile. And also the US, in order to continue this escalation, needs to understand that there are multiple rare earth minerals that go into every single missile and guidance system that they're currently using, which China has currently embargoed. So once again, even if the THAAD system were working, and it clearly is not in this situation, they would be facing a depletion of their capacity very rapidly.
Well, yeah, Danny,
yeah,
I just want to make one other quick point based on what KJ said, which is the term bully. Israel, I mean, it really is this simple. Israel is this big colonial bully that is used to attacking every neighbor it has, most of the countries in the region. They never attack Saudi Arabia or the UAE, of course, because they're loyal, Israeli allies. But they've attacked Syria. They're occupying Syria. They've attacked Lebanon. They tried to occupy Lebanon. They're constantly attacking Palestine. They're attacking Yemen. They've attacked Iran multiple times. They've attacked Iraq, and they never expect a response. Whenever a country responds, then Israel's like, oh, we're the victim. Everyone needs to cry for us. The Yemenis are responding. Iran also responded after Israel it attacked Iran's consulate in Syria. Syria can't respond because it had a government that was responding, that was overthrown in an operation backed by the US and Israel and the Gulf monarchies. But they're so used to impunity, to no one pushing back, that as soon as someone pushes back, even though it's not in any way proportional compared to what Israel is doing, just minor pushback, and they lose their mind, and they go even further into a rage. And of course, this is the mentality of bullies. And this is exactly what the US government has done for decades. And at the end of the day, it always leads to overplaying their hand, overextension, and ultimately it puts them in a deeper crisis.
Yeah. And KJ, we often talk about this term, and I know, Ben, you've done a lot of work on this term too, blowback. And we often talk about it in terms of the proliferation, for example, of Al-Qaeda because of U.S. wars and direct U.S. support even, or indirect, direct, we can use those terms kind of loosely there. But this is another kind of blow. It's the resistance getting stronger. And, we've talked about Yemen and Ansar Allah with, hypersonic missiles that they've been building and preparing to fight a war to defend themselves, and now to stand in solidarity with Gaza. And you also have Iran at the same time that this is happening, unveiling their own new ballistic missile, which they're saying THAAD systems are not going to be able to stop. The US's air defense systems, Israeli air defense, they're not going to be able to stop. So this is, I think this is a huge turning point. Where does this fit, KJ, for all of you in this larger shift globally? Because I think oftentimes we talk about this separate and in a vacuum, but where does this fit all in this larger geopolitical shift we're seeing worldwide?
Well, I think, to give it broad brushstrokes, the US has always considered itself to have a monopoly on violence, that it is the hegemon that can exert violence all around the world and twist the world to its own designs. That has been debunked in this very, very graphic way with this most recent issue. But I think it's not simply blowback, but it's also the fact that the US doesn't seem to be able to understand that their opponents are capable of counter moves. They think that all they have to do is do something and the other side will simply capitulate. It's the idea, it's the bully idea that if I bully you, if I hit you, you're just going to take it. They don't understand that counter moves can be made, and that, this, small target that you have been bullying has a capacity to grow, to develop, to react, to create countermeasures. In the larger perspective, the US has always had different kinds of offset, asymmetrical ways of overcoming other countries. The first offset was what we call mass. This is simply, we have more firepower than you. We have a larger explosive power than you. When that was matched by other countries such as China and Russia getting mass, such as the atomic or nuclear bombs, then the US shifted to what is called the second offset. The second offset is this notion of precision, that we can attack your targeting platforms before they even get off the ground. So precision beats mass. And then the third offset is what we call diffusion. It's this notion that if we distribute and diffuse our capacity to attack, then even if you have precision, we can overcome that, like a cloud or a network attack with drones. That, again, has been shown to be not viable, in particular in the Ukraine war, where the Russians have shown that they can match and actually outmatch anything the US is doing on the war, on the battlefield, with their own network drones and automated weapons platforms. And I think we're seeing the same thing. If you'll pardon the analogy, when the Third World liberation movement started to gain power, one of the reasons why they were so effective was that the AK-47 was widely distributed, which was an equalizing force against the colonial powers that had always had this massive firepower advantage. When the AK was distributed throughout the Third World, this became this huge equalizer that was able to create massive disruption and eventually defeats for the colonial powers, so that they started to retreat. This is why you have, at least, 3 countries in the global south that have the AK-47 on their flag or on their coat of arms. And I think the similar situation is, we're starting to see that. We see that, even small powers can have long-range standoff capacities, that they have a capacity to network these attacks. They have the capacity to create diffuse, layered attacks that can penetrate even the most sophisticated and expensive, and I emphasize expensive, air defense systems. And so once again, I think we're seeing, kind of a paradigm shift in the very nature of war.
Yeah, and to mention drones, Yemen has took down, some say 20, some say 12 to 15, but regardless, the cost has been about 60 million US dollars. I think they run about 2 to 3 million a pop. Ben, any final thoughts on this? Because there's just I think there's so much to say about what's happening here. I'm curious on your if you have any final thoughts on this issue.
KJ raised some really important points, especially about the AK-47, of course, designed by the Soviet Union, made very cheaply and reliable for Global South national liberation movements. And this Soviet technology was one of the main reasons that anti-colonial movements were successful. Because, of course, there were always, over the hundreds of years of European colonialism, there were always revolutionary movements against colonialism, but many of them failed precisely because they didn't have the technology necessary and the political support necessary to overcome the colonialists. But after World War II, you had the destruction of the European empires physically through the war. And then you also had this new technology with support from the Soviet Union and then support from the People's Republic of China. All these conditions came together and made it possible for the anti-colonial movements to be successful. And today, it's not exactly the same. You don't have a Soviet Union anymore, but you do have similar breakthroughs in cheap and reliable technologies, especially from China. You know, we're talking about these drones. Where do all the parts for these drones come from? Of course, from China, which now is the world's manufacturing superpower. It makes all of these products very reliable and very cheap. And of course, China is a peaceful power. It has not been involved in a war since 1979. And China has encouraged peace in West Asia and supported the Palestinians and tried to broker peace. But at the same time, and you know, so China will go out of its way to say we're not trying to encourage more violence and give weapons, but you know, they happily sell all of these parts, and then these third world nationalist movements can use those parts to make the drones, just like the Soviet Union had provided the AK-47 to these global South national liberation movements. I mean, it's not exactly one-on-one of a parallel, but there certainly are some similarities there. And in terms of the geopolitical situation changing, I mean, if you look at West Asia, the situation is very different today. And I think this explains why the US and Israel are so violent, so murderous, so extreme, so desperate, because the reality is that the US is getting pushed out of this region. Now, if you go back just a few decades, the US had almost complete hegemonic control over West Asia, the so-called Middle East. But increasingly, many of these countries in the region, even though their leadership, their governments, don't believe in anything except their own self-interest and money, but the reality is that they can see which direction the global economy is going in, and it's toward the East, it's toward Asia. China is already the largest trading partner of basically all of the countries in the region, including the Persian Gulf monarchies. And again, I mean, these are vain monarchies run by kings and princes. They don't believe in anything other than their own personal enrichment. But at the end of the day, they trade much more with China than they do with the US. So why would, if they only care about money, which is what they do, why would they side with the US over their largest trading partner? China's been the largest importer of oil and gas from West Asia, from the Persian Gulf, for a decade now. The US is actually the world's largest producer of oil. So why the US doesn't need oil from Saudi Arabia? China does, and it needs a lot to continue running this big manufacturing superpower that it is. So it's in their economic interest to, this is why they've been diversifying their geopolitical relations and playing kind of both sides. And the UAE joined BRICS, and Saudi Arabia was invited to join BRICS. It has not given an answer, likely because it's afraid of backlash from the US. But the point is that, you know, Israel is the only political entity in the region that is completely controlled by the US and everything that it does. This is why Netanyahu famously referred to Israel proudly as an unsinkable US aircraft carrier. And this is also the position of the US government going back to Alexander Haig, the former US Secretary of State, who said Israel's a big unsinkable aircraft carrier. So it's a huge US military base in the region that the US uses to dominate one of the most geostrategic regions, to put fear in all of these other countries in the regions and their governments, so they don't move completely toward the East and China. But if Israel were to face this kind of crisis like we're seeing now, and the regime in Israel were to be changed in some way, and then finally this yoke that is on all of these other countries in the region, this sword of Damocles hanging over them constantly, with the threat of the US using Israel to bomb them, to destroy their governments, like the US and its allies did to Syria. If Israel's regime is changed, then it's only inevitable that this region is going to deepen its integration with the rest of Asia, with Eurasian integration with China and BRICS and Russia, simply because it's in its economic interest to do so. So this is why the US and Israel are so desperate, because the US is losing its hegemony over this region. Everyone can see it.
I said final word, but maybe KJ, you can comment on this too, because I think it's such an important thing to highlight, that the United States is losing its influence, and that despite all of the violence, the horrors, the genocide, the constant acceleration and escalation of endless wars in this region, leading to what the dream for some of these neocons and imperialists is, which is war in Iran, we see the more that this happens, actually, the more resistance that comes out of it, and also the more that U.S. power in this region wanes. Your response, KJ, because a lot of people will say, well, the U.S. is killing a lot of people, Israel is killing a lot of people, they're powerful.
The US killed a lot of people in Vietnam, it killed a lot of people in Korea, killed a lot of people all over the world, and yet it has never won a war, certainly not against a peer competitor, anything that we could consider to be a peer competitor. So I think this notion that simply that it's killing or destroying in and of itself doesn't mean that it's doing anything particularly strategically effective. You know, a school shooter can kill a lot of people, but that doesn't mean that they have accomplished whatever it is they're trying to accomplish, if anything. And I think the US, as you point out, is going into this school shooter mode, that it's just kind of randomly accelerating and increasing violence in an act of desperation. It's like, the bar drunk, as the bar is closing, and their checks and their credit cards have been refused, they're looking for a fight. They want to take on a fight, and they're willing to fight anybody or everybody, if the case may be. But this is actually an act of madness. I think there are other dimensions that enter into the picture. Certainly, it's not simply on the military dimension, but it's also the US is losing power in the financial dimension, certainly because of the tariffs, but even before that, over a period of decades and decades of deindustrialization and shifting purely to a rentier financialized system, it has severely undermined itself without understanding that it's created completely rotten foundations for its own exertion of power. But I think, once again, not only is the US not thinking strategically, but it's not able to think dialectically, that, as you point out, it doesn't understand that what it does is going to create a counter move, a counter reaction, and that what they think is an exercise of force is actually a deep undermining of their own power. I think there's some deep thinking errors that are going on. Regarding Israel itself, I'll also point out that, not only is it the US's unsinkable aircraft in the area, but it also ties to the notion that the United States is trying to bottle off the planet with a series of choke points. And Israel is one of the key areas in which it seeks to dominate one of the key choke points of the planet. Once again, if you look at a map, you can see that there is the Eurasian continent and there is the African continent. And there is a tiny strip of land that functions almost as a court between these two enormous, powerful, resource-rich land masses, and that, of course, is Israel. And that is one of the reasons why Israel is so geostrategically important, as well as the fact that it acts as the bully and the enforcer of U.S. hegemony in the region.
Well, I'm glad, KJ, you brought up the financial component to all of this desperation that we've been talking about, because, Ben, I wanted to hear your thoughts on this. You recently have been covering the accelerating process of de-dollarization and China's leading role in it. I want to just pull up a couple of stories for you to comment on. I know that you had analyzed this one, how China is quietly diversifying from U.S. treasuries. This has been a big panic since Trump's tariffs began. What's going to happen to these treasuries? What is causing the sell-offs? Now, I also wanted to bring this up regarding de-dollarization, because it is a direct reference to it. And that has to do with Africa, which doesn't maybe get enough attention when it comes to this process and the China-Africa relationship. It says, why African traders are looking beyond the US dollar to China's yuan. Buyers in Africa favor doing business in the Chinese currency as geopolitical tensions heat up. Ben, talk about this process that's accelerating as the United States' economic war ramps up, not only on China, but really the entire world, and in particular, of the multipolar world.
China's been de-dollarizing for well over a decade. Of course, it didn't start with Donald Trump, but Trump's tariffs and trade war have really accelerated this process even further. So this really goes back to the 2008-2009 financial crisis, which of course started in the US and the US financial system. It was a wake-up call for many countries, including for China. The governor of the People's Bank of China, which is the Chinese central bank, issued a famous paper in which he called for a new financial order, and he called for alternatives to the US dollar. He proposed that we go back to look at the proposal made by John Maynard Keynes, the renowned economist at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, for a neutral global reserve asset. So that was in 2009 in response to the US financial crisis. And then starting in 2014, especially as the US engaged in quantitative easing, and a lot of countries feared that they would lose real value on their investments in US government debt over time. China, since 2014, has been steadily reducing its holdings of US Treasury securities. What's a Treasury security? It's US government debt. It's the bills, notes, and bonds sold by the US government. Now, since 2014, China has been reducing those holdings, but they're still really, really big because China has an enormous trade surplus with the rest of the world, a big current account surplus, because China is the world's manufacturing superpower. China produces about 35% of global manufacturing output, which is nearly 3 times the output of the US. China produces everything, and even a lot of what's produced in the US relies on inputs, on intermediate goods coming from China. And we're going to learn that very soon because there's going to be huge shortages in the US due to Trump's tariffs of 145% on China, because it's not just the goods that the US gets from China, but also the inputs needed to make goods domestically in the US. Okay, so China's been de-dollarizing. It still has enormous holdings because its reserves are over $3 trillion. Of those $3 trillion of reserves, over $700 billion are US Treasury securities. Even though the number has been falling over time, China doesn't want to just immediately sell all of them, because if it did that, one, it would be seen as a kind of act of economic war against the US, dumping all of this debt, and it could cause a bond crisis in the US, bond market crisis. Now, this is a card that China has, and the Wall Street Journal has been afraid of this. They're warning that Trump thinks China has no cards. It has this really big card, which is it could dump all of this US government debt and cause a huge crisis in the US bond market. But of course, that would be seen as an escalation. China doesn't want to do that. China also doesn't want to do that because they would lose value on those bonds, because if you're just selling things at a fire sale into the market at a loss, you're going to be losing money. So if you do it steadily over time, you don't disrupt the market, at least you'll keep your value over time and you won't lose a lot of the value that China got from producing things. You know, the US, Trump complains about the US massive trade deficit, the current account deficit it has. But I mean, the US prints money and then gives other countries money and then imports real tangible goods produced by other countries. So Trump says the US is getting ripped off, but ironically, the US designed this system in a way to just be a vacuum cleaner to suck in all of these goods produced by workers around the world and to basically pay them with IOUs that the US government's never going to pay. Okay, so that's China's situation. What does China fear? Well, the reason that China's accelerated this slow, gradual de-dollarization is because of 2 main fears. One, China fears that the US will simply seize, that is, steal the nearly $800 billion of treasury securities that it holds in its reserves. And China's also afraid that the US will do a de facto default on its national debt. I'll start with number one. There's a precedent for this, which is in 2022, the US and the European Union seized $300 billion worth of dollar and euro denominated assets held by Russia, by the Russian central bank. This was money belonging to the people of Russia. It was not Putin's bank account. It was the Russian central bank's reserves used to stabilize the Russian ruble, the currency used by all Russians. Well, Joe Biden famously said that the US wanted to collapse the Russian currency. He wanted to turn the ruble into rubble. They failed to do that, but they were trying to do so, which would have caused extreme economic suffering for all Russians. It was collective punishment of the entire Russian population because all Russians use the ruble. It's not just Vladimir Putin. So the US and the EU seized $300 billion worth of those assets. And this came after the US and the Western powers also seized many billions of dollars of assets belonging to Iran, Syria, North Korea, Afghanistan, and of course, Venezuela. Let's not forget that in Trump's first term, he launched a coup attempt against Venezuela, and the US and European countries stole billions of dollars from the reserves of Venezuela, including gold. There's still gold, billions of dollars of gold that belongs to the people of Venezuela that is sitting in the Bank of England that was stolen from the people of Venezuela. They refused to give it back. Their original excuse was that they didn't recognize the elected president, Nicolás Maduro. Now, and they previously recognized this US appointed coup puppet, Juan Guaido, whom Trump nominated to be fake president, despite the fact that he never participated in a presidential election. Well, he no longer even pretends to be president. He claimed his so-called term, his imaginary term, ended, and yet the Western powers refused to give that money back to Venezuela. So they're pirates. So that was a wake-up call to many countries saying, wow, we cannot hold U.S. assets because they can just steal it. If they decide, if our government does something they don't like, they can just steal it from us, which is what they've done in all these countries. But previously, there were concerns, but they thought, okay, well, they're only going to do it to small countries with revolutionary governments like Venezuela or Iran. But then they did it to Russia in 2022, which is, a massive country, a great power. And this scared a lot of countries, including longtime U.S. allies like Saudi Arabia and Egypt and Turkey. And they started really heavily diversifying their reserves and buying a lot of gold, a whole lot of gold, and trying to sell off U.S. assets. So this is a process that's not new. But then there's one other element I mentioned, which is China is afraid of a de facto U.S. default. What do I mean by that? Well, Trump has this idea that he's going to force other countries to agree to a so-called Mar-a-Lago Accord, which is based on the Plaza Accord that the Reagan administration imposed on U.S. vassals, allies and vassals in 1985. This was when the U.S. dollar was very overvalued because the Fed under Paul Volcker significantly raised interest rates due to the big inflation in the 1970s. So the dollar was overvalued. That hurt U.S. manufacturing. And the Reagan administration, like Trump, said it wanted to help U.S. manufacturing by bringing down the overvalued dollar. So in the Plaza Accord in 1985, the U.S. forced West Germany, the UK, France, and Japan to help the U.S. to devalue the dollar against their currencies. This led to a big asset price bubble in Japan because the Japanese yen was significantly overvalued. It caused many economic problems in Japan. When the asset price bubble popped in the early 90s, it caused economic crisis, which is known as the lost decade of stagnation in Japan. So Trump wants to do that again because he thinks the dollar is very overvalued. He wants to do it again, ostensibly to help U.S. manufacturing to the extent it even exists. Because if the price of the dollar goes down against other currencies, it makes U.S. exports more competitive because they're cheaper for other people. So Trump wants to impose a similar deal that's informally known as the Mar-a-Lago Accord to force other countries, especially China, to allow the U.S. to devalue the dollar against their currencies like the yuan. Now, China is never going to do this in a million years. The Chinese economists and officials have closely studied the effect of the Plaza Accord on Japan. They would never fall for that again. Also, Japan has been militarily occupied by the U.S. for 80 years. It's not entirely sovereign. The U.S. has significant control over Japan's foreign policy. So Japan couldn't really say no, whereas China is much more independent, much more sovereign. So Trump thinks he can do that. It's not going to happen. He also thinks he can do it again to Japan, South Korea, European countries. Even that is not looking very probable. It is plausible, but it's not looking very probable because even Japan is pushing back. So what Chinese officials are saying is that if the U.S. does this, one, it would essentially amount to a default because the U.S. is going to force other countries to exchange their existing U.S. Treasury securities for 100-year U.S. government bonds with no coupon, with no yield on them, which means that every year they lose value because there's inflation. So they're helping to fund the U.S. government by lending the U.S. government money and getting nothing in return. So in 100 years, they'll get paid back the principal, but it's going to be very little with inflation. They're going to lose the vast majority of what they invested. So one, China is concerned that the U.S. is going to default. Two, China is concerned that the U.S. could seize its assets that it has in dollars. And three, China and many other countries can see that the US is not a reliable country and its financial system is increasingly in crisis. And it's likely there's going to be significant inflation in the near future in the US. So other currencies have been actually rising against the US dollar, like the Japanese yen, like the euro, like the Swiss franc. So even if you did invest in US assets and you weren't afraid of the US defaulting or afraid of the US seizing your assets, you're losing value in those US assets as the dollar falls against your currency. So increasingly, this is why even the mainstream Western financial press is saying that Trump said he was going to save the dominance of the US dollar. He's actually accelerating the decline of the dominance of the US dollar and forcing other firms around the world, not just governments, but companies, financial firms, to seek alternatives out of their own economic interests. It's not just geopolitical at this point, it's also economic.
Yeah, KJ, please jump right in.
Well, I think the other thing to notice is that China, I believe, is doing a kind of a Tai Chi move. When I say Tai Chi move, it's this notion that if you put pressure on somebody as they're moving, all of their attention goes to that part. And that gives you the capacity to do something even more fundamentally disruptive, which I think is what is happening. So this discussion around, treasuries and T-bills, all of that, I think, is in play. And I think the larger, deeper currents that are happening, which are invisible, but I think are very, very clear, is that China is building out a different financial system. I think we can go more into detail if necessary. But I think the key thing to remember is that the Chinese invented coinage. When the Romans were using salt, this is where we get the word salary, the Chinese were using minted coins. And then when the West finally caught up to minted coins, the Chinese in the Song and Tang dynasty were using paper notes. And paper notes function only if you have a highly structured and reliable central administrative system. And now China has already moved into digital wallets. Essentially, it's a digital society. Nobody uses cash in China anymore. And they're building out CBDCs. And with the rest of the world, they're building out various ledger and clearinghouse systems that are blockchain securitized, etc. So there's an entire vast architecture of alternative financial payment systems that are currently being built out. And I think the US doesn't really understand what's going on. I think they have some very, very basic, simple ideas of what currency and what money is. But as we know, money can be a medium, a measure, a standard, or a store. China is working on the standard, that is to say, something that can be used as legal tender in the digital domain as a way of keeping track of credits. And then it's also building out various kind of stores, commodity-related stores that assure the value. And this is very easy to do because China's key relationships are with the BRICS, which are all resource and energy powerhouses, whereas the US has fundamentally financialized its entire economic system. And so the only way that it has of asserting value is to have a highly functioning system that is rule-bound and regular and reliable, which is no longer happening. And the other is to exert force, but it can no longer do that. And so I think this kind of financialized approach and its kind of attempt to extract rentier profits on pain of coercive power is no longer going to be capable. I think that very soon many countries are going to call the bluff on that.
Yeah, and Ben, you mentioned all the ways in which the world is doing it, and in this South China Morning Post article, I want your comment on this. They talk about how in Kenya there are traders, the local traders, who are establishing localized system for settling payments for Chinese imports in their own respective currencies. And you've also talked a lot about currency swaps and things of this nature. So what is the exact architecture then of this? Because a lot of people will dismiss de-dollarization, say, well, it's the US dollar is going to be the foreign reserve currency for a long time. But yet you see the poorest countries in the world, the most underdeveloped, those within BRICS who are coming together as formerly part of the third world, they're coming together to accelerate this process and do it in their own respective ways that might go above or beyond or fill in more detail than just this notion that, well, the currency is going to be replaced, the dollar is going to be replaced altogether. Your assessment and analysis.
Yeah, I often say that when we talk about de-dollarization, we have to distinguish between two different kinds: de-dollarization of trade and de-dollarization of savings. Now, de-dollarization of trade is what we're talking about here, and frankly, it's kind of easy to do. You just trade with your local currencies, and there have been many new institutions set up that allow this to happen, including, China has developed its alternative to the SWIFT interbank messaging system that's dominated by the US. Russia has also developed an alternative to SWIFT, and China increasingly is using its own currency, the yuan or renminbi. Yuan, for people who are confused, the renminbi is the official name. Yuan is the unit. So it's like a dollar, right? Or like a buck. You say like $5. So yuan is what's often said. And so China now does slightly over half of its bilateral trade with other countries in yuan, in its local currency. But China still holds a lot of dollars in its reserve. So those are two different things, right? If you look at BRICS, a lot of countries in BRICS are now trading in their local currencies. Brazil and China signed an agreement to trade in their local currencies. China and Russia now trade, they do more than 90% of their bilateral trade in either yuan or rubles. And, Russia and India are doing trade in the local currencies, Russia and Iran. That's not that difficult to do. What is more difficult is to de-dollarize savings, because what are foreign exchange reserves? It's essentially the savings held by a central bank in order to stabilize the currency in case the central bank needs to intervene in the foreign exchange market to either appreciate or depreciate their currency in case there's some kind of crisis and they have a big current account deficit or surplus or whatever. So de-dollarizing savings is a little more difficult, but that's also happening because, until recently, what we constantly heard from especially Western financial analysts is that there's no alternative to the dollar as a savings asset, that it's the cleanest shirt in the laundry basket, that, there are other currencies that also are possible. You could buy assets in those other currencies, but they don't have large and liquid enough bond markets. So for instance, China has been buying a lot of other countries' sovereign debt. So European bonds, even Japanese bonds to a lesser extent. And the argument made is that, well, Canada has a bond market, Germany has a bond market, the UK has a bond market, but these bond markets are not nearly big enough and they're not nearly liquid enough to replace the US bond market. What does liquid mean? In finances, how easily you can move in and out of the asset, exchange it if you want to get back into cash. And yeah, the US bond market is enormous because US government debt is so big. It's very easy to buy and sell bonds on a daily basis. It's a little slower for some of these smaller bond markets, but you have to so you trade the risk in terms of liquidity with the risk in terms of safety, because maybe the US bond market is more liquid and larger, but it's not as secure because the US can just steal it from you if you buy it. And two, increasingly, as we see in the US, it's likely that bondholders are going to lose value over time with stubborn and persistent inflation in the US. And Trump he keeps saying he wants to bring down interest rates, and he wants to remove Jerome Powell, the chair of the Fed, because Powell is not reducing interest rates fast enough. So Trump really wants bondholders to take a big haircut in the sense that they'll be holding on to these bonds that over time are going to lose value because Trump wants much lower interest rates despite higher inflation. So if you have inflation of 5% and you're getting paid 4% on your bond, you're actually losing value over time. So despite all of the supposed advantages of the US bond market being so big and deep and liquid, in reality, countries have been looking for alternatives. And one of them is simply gold. I mean, this is why the price of gold has been skyrocketing. It's now well over $3,000. And you look at a chart of gold just in the past 2 or 3 years, and it's basically, it's just completely up with almost no exceptions. And it's going to continue going up because what we're seeing essentially is the devaluing of the US dollar against gold. And Trump, as much as he said he was going to save the dominance of the US dollar, he's sending many messages to people around the world that even holding dollar assets in your savings, in your reserves, is no longer reliable. So previously, when we talked about de-dollarization in the past few years, it was mostly de-dollarization of trade, like you were talking about in Kenya. I mean, in every single country in Africa, their largest trading partner is China. And obviously it makes sense. They import many things from China, including cars, electric vehicles, solar panels, machines, so many things. China produces everything. What would they import from the US? They would import soybeans. They would import oil. I mean, the US doesn't produce that much anymore. It's a financialized economy. So it makes sense that these countries are looking for ways to, one, to reduce the cost of doing business, because every time they have to exchange for dollars and then maybe exchange for yuan or just pay in dollars, regardless, they have to pay some fees every time they do that when you settle those in dollars. So they'll cut out the middleman, reduce trade costs by settling in their local currencies. It's better for them anyway. And then they also don't need to deal with the US banking system, because the US controls the international financial system, at least the one that it created, although China is creating an alternative kind of parallel financial system. And the way that many international transactions worked until recently, it's changing, but most of the time when trade was settled between different banks, because, you know, an importer in Kenya will have their own bank in Kenya, and then an exporter in China will have their own bank. And how do those banks communicate? They almost always, until recently, did so through what was known as a correspondent bank. And until recently, almost always that was a US bank, largely in New York, like JP Morgan, Bank of America. So what happened is that the US claimed that all of these transactions touched US soil, in scare quotes, because they went through a US correspondent bank, even though it's all digital. And that means that the US said that every transaction involving dollars had to abide by US law, including anti-money laundering law, including know your customer law. And of course, when the US has sanctions on a country, it says, oh, well, if you're doing trade with Iran or North Korea or something, then you're violating our sanctions. Therefore, we're going to take action against you, even though we're not involved in the transaction, even though it's a transaction between like China and North Korea or Huawei and Iran. The US says, well, it goes through a correspondent bank. Therefore, you're violating our law. Therefore, we're going to take action against you, which was one of the excuses used to imprison, effectively do house imprisonment of the CFO of Huawei. That was done by Canada, but the US was trying to extradite her on these bogus charges of doing trade with Iran. China doesn't have sanctions on Iran. China can trade with Iran all at once, but not when the US has this system in which it's always the middleman. So cut out the US middleman and you solve all those problems. So again, the more that the US bullies countries and pushes them around, the more it actually accelerates the decline of this very system that it created to benefit itself.
Yeah, KJ, definitely come in here. I just want to say I just remember during the 2019-2020, the Hong Kong riots that the U.S. supported. They threw in there into their legislation around Hong Kong, sanctions on Hong Kong if Hong Kong violated sanctions on Iran and the DPRK. It just goes to show how extensively reliant the U.S. is on this form of warfare. But KJ, please come in.
Yeah, so they're using lawfare and financial warfare to control the entire global system. I think the point that Ben makes is it's a very, very important point. Remember when Meng Wanzhou was indicted, she was indicted in the New York Southern District Court. Now, what in the F does New York Southern District Court have? Why does it have any jurisdiction over a transaction done in China with a Hong Kong bank, with business in Iran? Why do they have any jurisdiction there? And of course, as Ben points out, it's because the dollar clearing goes through New York, and because it transitions through New York for a tiny number of microseconds, the US claims long-arm jurisdiction. But all of this is a violation of the spirit of the financial system itself. The financial system only works if people trust each other. You know, everything is based on credit, and credit simply means I believe you, I trust you. And when you break that trust, you have already broken the foundations of the financial system. So by hyper sanctioning, hyper weaponizing its control of the financial system, the US is actually driving other countries far, far away from the system. And therefore, this is going to result in a continuous process of de-dollarization. De-dollarization has been happening steadily over the past 2 decades. Currently, we've diversified into a basket of at least 40 different currencies. But as I said, as the architecture is built out, and as we have, you know, digital clearing houses and digital ledgers that are set up, essentially this entire system of financialized trade, that is to say, this is where money is used as a medium of exchange and a standard of deferred payment. All of that can be subsumed under these new electronic architectures that China is building out. Those will be powerful and transformational. The other value is, the other, you know, dimension is the value of money as a store of value. And that is a more difficult process. But as Ben points out, it's moving into commodities, in particular bullion and metals. But ultimately, I think it all boils down once again to the fact that the entire financial architecture is built on the understanding that there are going to be some foundational rules that allow trade and transactions to happen with reliability, that are not arbitrary, capricious, and driven purely by power. And the US has been abusing this power over and over again. It doesn't realize that the more that it does this, the more it undermines its own capacity to control the financial system. So as it grasps harder, you know, its power, you know, seeps out faster from between its fingers. And I think that also, you know, certainly in the case of Hong Kong is a major financial center. And by weaponizing the financial system against Hong Kong, simply, once again, it sent the message that the US is not a reliable partner and not a reliable guardian or, you know, steward of a global system, of a global financial system. And therefore, it is actually signed the death warrant of the dollar and the US financial system itself. It just doesn't realize that that's what has been happening.
Yeah, and Ben, I think this is a good place to pivot now, because you know, the US's financial dominance and the dominance of the dollar is undergirded by its military dominance, or at least perceived military dominance. And while the United States, Donald Trump's administration is very busy continuing arms sales to Ukraine, escalating in West Asia, I wanted to just pull up, you know, there's been a lot of chatter from the Indo-Pacific Command about Taiwan of late that hasn't been getting a lot of attention. And Samuel Paparo, who heads the Indo-Pacific Command right now, had this to say about Taiwan. He said, the United States will prevail in a conflict with China as it stands now with the forces that we have right now. However, he says the U.S. is on a bad trajectory. And that trajectory is that China right now is outproducing the United States 2 submarines a year for 1.4 made in the U.S. It also builds 6 combatant warships annually compared to just 1.8 manufactured in the United States. And essentially, what he is so scared of is that China, of course, the narrative is going to take over Taiwan militarily by force. Now, Ben, as I said before, the U.S. is very much caught up in many different fronts. Talk about your reaction to this, because it seems that this is kind of happening maybe underneath our noses, and not many are paying attention to it right now, this build up toward war with China over this particular flashpoint, Taiwan. But Also, there's massive military drills happening in and around the Philippines. Your assessment of this situation?
Yeah, well, we see an example of how it's actually the productive capacity of your economy that's more important than just the GDP number. And we constantly hear, Western economists say, look, China is still so poor, their GDP per capita is so much lower than that of the US. But then when you actually look at what China can produce, you realize that the US economy is much smaller than it looks like according to GDP, considering that 18% of US GDP comes from the healthcare sector, which is one of the worst in the advanced countries in the world. Among the rich countries, the US spends the most on healthcare, twice the OECD average, and has the worst public health results. Over 20% of US GDP comes from the finance, insurance, and real estate sector. So if you just move money around in banks and banks charge you higher fees, GDP goes up. How much of US GDP, 1 or 2% comes from lawyers charging more and more money. So the reality is that it's actually the productive capacity of your economy that's much more important. And China is the world's manufacturing superpower. It produces about 35% of global manufacturing output, gross output, which is roughly 3 times the US. So when it comes to the military, this is obviously much more important. Another good example of this is Ukraine, right? We constantly heard from US officials, they said, Russia's a gas station posing as a country. And they said, look at Russia's GDP per capita. It's lower than, Russia's GDP as a country supposedly is lower than Italy's. Well, a lot of that was because of the exchange rate. When you actually measure purchasing power parity, Russian GDP is much higher. But regardless, we saw that it's actually the productive capacity of your economy that's more important. And Russia has been able to outproduce all of NATO when it comes to actual armaments and ammunition to fight this proxy war that the US-led NATO forces were waging against Russia. And NATO lost that proxy war. So now they're preparing for a new proxy war in Taiwan. And this is even crazier because, Ukraine is not part of Russia. Taiwan is part of China, according to international law. Go to the United Nations. They do not recognize Taiwan as a country. The UN recognizes that Taiwan is a province of China. Hilariously, I constantly go through IMF data. The International Monetary Fund, which is largely controlled by the US, if you go to their website, they say, look at the Taiwan data. It says Taiwan, province of China. According to international law, Taiwan is part of China. And yet the US has been selling billions of dollars of weapons to these separatist forces in Taiwan who are not popular. If you look at polls, over 80% of people in Taiwan want the status quo. They do not want independence. The people who want immediate independence in Taiwan, the people who want immediate independence are a small fraction of the population. It has never reached 10%. It has always been in the single digits of the people in Taiwan who want immediate independence. And yet the US is supporting these extremist forces, giving them billions of dollars of weapons in violation of the agreements that the US signed with China when it normalized relations with China. These are known as the 3 communiques. The first was signed when Richard Nixon visited China in 1972, in which the US recognized that both sides across the Taiwan Strait recognize that there's only one China. The US recognized that. In 1979, when the US officially established diplomatic relations with the PRC, it also reaffirmed the one China principle. And in 1982, in the 3rd communique, the US said it promised that over time it would stop selling weapons to Taiwan. Well, here we are over 40 years later, and not only is the US continuing to sell weapons to Taiwan separatists, it's actually accelerating those sales, selling more and more. And that's clearly a direct violation of the 1982 communique that the US signed. Not to mention the one China principle, which the only reason that China agreed to normalize relations with the US is because the US said that it recognized the one China policy. Well, here we are, and the US has been violating the one China policy in spirit. So now these figures in the Pentagon are saying we need more money. That's what he's really saying. Samuel Paparo. By the way, Samuel Paparo is the head of the so-called Indo-Pacific Command. You know, that's a term created by the U.S., Asia-Pacific region. And recently, the alcoholic Christian fundamentalist defense secretary, Pete Hegseth, who is a fundamentalist, he wrote a book called American Crusade.
Which you read.
Sorry?
Which you read, which you were...
Yeah, crazy book.
You.
Honestly, it's insane. I can't believe this guy is the head of the Pentagon. He published this in 2020. And in this book, he calls for overthrowing the Chinese government. And on the first page, he says that we're in a holy war against the international left, China, and Islam, all Muslims. This is the guy who's the head of the Pentagon, who, again, is also a barely functioning alcoholic. And anyway, the point is that he took a trip to the Philippines and Japan. And when he was in Japan, he announced that the U.S. is turning Japan into a war-fighting base. He loves that term, war-fighting. He's like, the only thing we exist to do is for war fighting. We're preparing for war. And of course, when they say war, they mean war on China, specifically over Taiwan. And when he was in Japan, he also mentioned this guy, Samuel Paparo, the head of U.S. Indo-Pacific Command. And Hegseth said that Paparo has, quote, real war plans, end quote. Real war plans. That was a term he used. So it's clear that when they talk about Taiwan and all of this, they're preparing for war. It's not just hypothetical. They're like, we're going to be waging a war against the mainland, Chinese mainland, as soon as 2027. That's the date often thrown around based on a kind of out of context comment made by China's president Xi Jinping, where he said we should be prepared for a potential conflict by 2027. A lot of people in the West are saying that he said that he's going to launch the war in 2027. That's not what he said. But anyway, they're talking about preparing for war as soon as then. And this is why also the U.S. is telling Taiwan, we need to take all of your important companies out of Taiwan because we're preparing for you to be destroyed, like Ukraine was destroyed. So this is what's happening with the most important Taiwanese company, which is the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC, which produces the majority of the world's most advanced chips. And the U.S. is engaged in a chip war against China. The Trump administration and the Biden administration put export restrictions on China to try to prevent the mainland from getting access to the most advanced chips, which they thought were needed to develop artificial intelligence, although obviously China's been able to do that despite not having access to the most high-end chips. We saw this with DeepSeek making a big breakthrough and other Chinese companies making breakthrough in AI development. So now, this is not just Trump, it's also Biden. The U.S. was trying to force TSMC to move its facilities and technology to the U.S. Biden offered tens of billions of dollars of subsidies to open factories in Arizona. And then they realized that they had no U.S. workers who knew how to actually develop these advanced semiconductors because it's very capital intensive, very, very skilled labor. And the U.S. is deindustrialized. They don't have the workers who know how to do this. So what happened is that TSMC, half of its employees were just taken from Taiwan. They moved with their families to Arizona to work in these factories. And Trump is now forcing TSMC to send more of this technology and investment to the U.S. because they're preparing for it to all be destroyed in a war. I mean, it's incredible. It's really shocking.
Yeah, it truly is. And KJ, I want to bring you in here and I want to show you this. I called it on this show. I said, we saw it with the threat assessment from the so-called DNI. And many people thought that the Trump administration was going to come in and change the priorities of the U.S. toward a more America, quote unquote, first policy. But this is what's going on right now. The Pentagon is tapping a policy chief, and this is the second in command or third in command of the Department of Defense, Eldridge Colby, for the national security strategy. And I want to just go down to the priorities that are being cited here. The Department of Defense has been operating under interim guidance at prioritizing thwarting China's threats to forcibly annex Taiwan, also preserving strong U.S. influence in the Indo-Pacific region. So it appears that this, what Ben said, is exactly what is happening, and that's what's going to come out in this national security strategy that comes out with every presidential term. But KJ, please come in and your thoughts and
Yeah.
reactions.
I'm really sorry, KJ. I just want to add one quick comment while we're talking about Eldridge Colby. People should go check out this guy's Twitter account. He's an insane war hawk. All of his tweets until recently, when he was nominated for the Trump administration, for years, all of his tweets have been about, we need to prepare for war with China, war with China, war with China. He can't, like, that's all he talks about. And this guy is now going to be one of the top officials in the Pentagon. This shows that they're very serious about this. It's not just rhetoric. This guy is obsessed with war with China.
Absolutely. He's completely and totally obsessed with war with China. He's right now trying to give a good facade of seeming like the rational one in charge of, that he's some kind of intellectual who has deeply thought about defense issues and security issues. But actually, he is at the end of the day, he's pretty much a rabid China hawk. If you look at his earlier stuff, he puts out this kind of 20-step syllogism why we have to go to war. 20-step syllogism. It's, there's no beginning and end to the stupidity of his reasoning. But essentially, his point is that we have to go to war. And people have, said, oh, Elbridge Colby is not a neocon because he's not what they call a primacist. Primacist meaning somebody who believes in unipolar global hegemony. But they refer to him as what is called a prioritizer, as opposed to others who they refer to as restrainers. And his whole worldview is based on that we need to prioritize war against China. We need to prepare for war against China. And he wrote this book, Strategy of Denial, which has to do with how we wrong-foot China into starting a war over Taiwan, upon which we pile in, and then we, let everything loose. Essentially, this is his strategy. He wants to provoke war, and Taiwan is his key focus. And it's this kind of insane, Manichaean, aggressive worldview that China has to be taken down. Although he does give a little veneer of, NatSec, polished NatSec, East Coast security talk. At core, he is an unreconstituted neocon. And probably the best way to see that is that there is another expert whose name escapes me, but sometimes they have debates. And when I think of it, I'll let you know. But anyway, if you watch him in dialogue, very rapidly he starts to leak out how rabid he is about China. If we pan out and we look at the global stage right now, we can see that everything is being set up for war with China in terms of industrial capacity. Of course, the US does not have the industrial capacity to go to war with China, but what it is doing is subcontracting all of its military supply chains to Japan and Korea. So, for example, Hanwha and Hyundai, currently, the Pentagon brass is in Korea right now, having them explore and prepare to sign contracts to subcontract the building of ships for the US military, which is technically not allowed, but they want to seek a presidential exemption for that. South Korea has already taken on contracts to do immediate battle repair for US ships that are damaged in warfare. And once again, this is, Hanwha and Hyundai, which traditionally, Hanwha is a newer munitions company, but Hyundai has traditionally been a US subcontractor. It was a subcontractor to Halliburton during the Vietnam War, and that's how it became, rich and powerful. Same thing is going on with Japan. And also, Japan is currently shifting to a Korea model of military control. What do I mean by that? The US has said that they want to impose a joint command on the Japanese military. Now, South Korea already has a joint command whereby, ostensibly the two militaries are supposed to be jointly controlled. But if you have a US 4-star and a Korean 4-star, guess who is really in control? It's the US. And essentially, the US has operational control over all of Korea's 3.6 million troops. And the same thing with Japan. The US is currently looking to create a Korea-type structure where it has total control over Japanese troops. Remember, Japan has the 5th most powerful military in the world, soon to have the 3rd largest military budget in the world, certainly one of the most powerful navies in the world. The Japanese have just passed a resolution saying that they want to integrate Japan into a kind of single theater of command that encompasses Taiwan and all of the Pacific. Essentially, the Japanese are saying wherever the US goes to war, the Japanese military will go to war with them. And they're setting up the legal and political and military structures to enable that to happen. The Philippines right now is also preparing for war. Remember, the Philippines is the closest area that controls the South China Sea. The South China Sea is the choke point whereby which the US wants to choke off China's trade. And in so doing, they think they can strangle and force China to tap out. The Philippines has been undergoing a dirty war against its insurgents that are opposed to the government. These are largely leftist insurgents. And the Philippines has been going through kind of a scorched earth strategy using incredibly sophisticated electronic counterinsurgency means to wipe out all of its opponents. And it's doing that, once again, in preparation for war against China. And of course, we know that they've put the Dhaiphong systems in the Philippines. Of course, Korea is currently under chaos. There was a near military coup. Lee Jae-myung looked for a moment that he was going to become the president because he's the leading opposition party candidate, but he is opposed to US war. He wants to balance back towards China, and he does not want to be, a subcontractor to US militarism. And the US hates him. And so just very recently, there has been a judicial coup that very likely will disqualify Lee Jae-myung from becoming or even running for president. And that will allow the US to open up the field, in which case Han Duck-soo, who is a kind of US favorite, he's the current prime minister and former acting president, is likely to be a shoo-in. He'll be a kind of a bland, spineless bureaucrat who will bend to the US will, a little bit like the UN Secretary General, who was also a US quisling. So there's so much that is happening right now, both in the Philippines, in Korea, in Japan, and also, as Ben has pointed out, in Taiwan. But we can see the large structures. Essentially, what's happening is the US is reshoring and friendshoring military production capacity to its quislings and allies, namely Japan, Korea, and also India. And at the same time, it's setting the stage. It's preparing the war zone for imminent battle by escalating and staging these various military platforms, that is to say Korea, Japan, and the Philippines, and also Taiwan in preparation for war. So we're in a very, very, dangerous moment. And as the US becomes more and more desperate, it's more and more likely to reach out and to resort to extreme means. Does any of this make sense? Does the US actually have the capacity to fight a war and beat China? Absolutely not. Even with India, Japan, Korea, Philippines, all of it, they cannot win a war. It's simply not possible. Just as they cannot, defeat or, silence the Ansar Allah. But, I've said this before, is, there's 6% of sentient adults in the United States who believe that they can beat a grizzly bear with their bare hands. Okay, that's 6% of sentient adults. And I believe that the Pentagon is subject to the geostrategic or military equivalent of that fallacy, that it believes that it can wage a war against China and win. Of course, what that really means is that they're going to go nuclear and they're going to do a first strike and essentially engage in a nuclear sucker punch. But even that is kind of an absurd proposition.
Yeah, Ben, anything you want to add? I mean, when KJ said that about the grizzly bear data there. Made me think about how in this tariff war, trade war Trump has waged, public opinion on China has actually risen to the point where I think Pew research says I think 5 to 7% has been shaven off that humongous 80-90% negative favorability that people in the U.S. have of China, but it's still really large. And so your final thoughts on just this overall situation that KJ laid out, plus, you're in China right now, plus the fact that there's this huge misunderstanding that still goes on, which kind of lays the basis for this very reckless and potentially fatal final war, I tend to call it, for the U.S. As an imperialist, albatross and empire.
Yeah, KJ is great with analogies. I love that analogy of the people in the U.S. who think they could fight a bear with their bare hands, and the geopolitical equivalent of that being the U.S. military thinking it could easily win a war with China. It's completely crazy, but we've seen again and again that the U.S. government is completely out of touch with reality. And this is what happens when you have these extreme ideologues who take power and they're totally out of touch with reality. And this is what the Trump administration represents. I mean, not that like the Democrats were so much better or anything. I mean, they were carrying out so many crimes, and Biden was saying he was asleep at the wheel is being generous. I mean, he was just an empty shell. His brain didn't work. But I mean, the Trump administration is full of these far-right ideologues who are totally out of touch with reality. And look at how they've done the trade war. Look at how they implemented it. Trump thought that China would immediately buckle. As Scott Bessent, his billionaire Treasury Secretary, claimed, Bessent said that China is playing with a pair of twos, that they love to portray everything as a card game. That's also what Trump told Zelensky. He said, you don't have any cards. We have the cards. Well, the reality is that, as the joke has, it's gone viral on the internet, says, China makes the cards. The U.S. doesn't make anything. Trump thought that he would threaten first, 43% or whatever, and the number kept increasing of tariffs, 34%, 54%. The number kept going up. Now it's 145% tariffs on China. And yet China has not given in. It's the U.S. that has been giving in. Trump blinked, if you will. Trump had to put exceptions on for Chinese technologies, especially semiconductors, phones, cell phones, and computers and other electronics, because the U.S. can't produce those. And he knew, especially because Tim Cook from Apple was calling him up and saying, you need to issue exemptions or the iPhone's going to be $10,000. So we also saw that the Trump administration assumed that China couldn't respond in any way. Well, China responded by, one, issuing actual reciprocal tariffs. Trump claimed his tariffs were reciprocal. They were not reciprocal. They were unilateral and aggressive. China's tariffs in response to Trump's tariffs are actual reciprocal, proportional tariffs. And then China also took measures like restricting the export of rare earth elements, which are needed for advanced technologies. So the U.S. assumed that it had all of this leverage over China. It's actually China that has more leverage over the U.S. There's this idea that China is so dependent on exports to the U.S. market. This was repeated by Trump's billionaire Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick. And Lutnick said, they export so much to us, there's no alternative. Well, first of all, China's exports as a percentage of GDP are about 20% of GDP, which is a lot, but it's actually below the global average, which is 30%. And it's certainly below Germany and South Korea, which are also very export-oriented economies. China has a massive internal market of 1.4 billion people. The vast majority of the cars, for instance, that China makes are bought internally, locally. And Chinese cars are very popular. You can see them in the roads everywhere you go. I mean, I was just in Shanghai. I live in Beijing. It's true here as well, but especially in Shanghai, because different cities and provinces have different laws and subsidies and policies promoting different policies. And they, in particular, have policies promoting the purchase of electric vehicles. And there are a lot of EVs here in Beijing, But in Shanghai, it's like 80 or 90% of the cars you see on the road are EVs, and almost all of them are Chinese made, basically all of them. In Beijing, I would say it's like maybe 50 to 60% of cars are EVs, and they're mostly Chinese companies. And the funny thing is, I was in Shanghai for a few days, and with a friend of mine, I was joking. I was like, we should try to count the number of different Chinese EV brands we see, because you see so many companies you've never even heard of. There are literally dozens of Chinese EV manufacturers. So, I mean, the idea that China can only export, and it just, people are so out of touch with reality. And when you have people like Gordon Chang, you know, who's been saying for decades that China's on the verge of collapse, and every year he moves the date. China's going to collapse next year. It's going to be next year. It's going to be next year.
And now he's saying they need war. So it's not just they're going to collapse, but they need war in order to not collapse. That's his new narrative, or at least not new narrative, but that's what he's pushing now. But continue.
Yeah, and these are basically the people advising Trump, and not only advising Trump, filling his administration. You know, Marco Rubio is an unhinged neoconservative, and he's tried to rebrand himself as, you know, like a populist and a social conservative, or whatever. No, I mean, he's been an unrepentant warmonger his entire political career. He's not just the head of the State Department. He's now the head of the National Security Council,
Yes,
because
Waltz.
Mike Waltz was moved from National Security Advisor to UN Ambassador. So now Marco Rubio is both Secretary of State and National Security Advisor. To my knowledge, the only other person who had both positions, I think, was Henry Kissinger. Maybe there are other people, but like, I mean, this is crazy. So the people, these are the people who are determining the policy in China. I spoke with a guy who works in finance, and he said that he worked with Scott Bessent back when Bessent, ironically, was working for George Soros, you know, who's like the main boogeyman of the Republican Party. But now George Soros's underling, Scott Bessent, this billionaire hedge fund manager, is running Trump's treasury. And this guy who had experience working in the financial sector here in China, he said that he worked with Bessent, and Bessent was totally ignorant about China. And he was just like this crazy anti-communist who said that China's economy is going to collapse. Nothing works. All of their statistics are fake. They don't make anything. This is the guy running the treasury. And this is why he thought that China would immediately buckle, because really, when you underestimate your adversary, you commit all of these stupid errors. And this is why China, by the way, has always erred on the side of, whereas the US is always boasting, China's doing the opposite. China is always maintaining a low profile and biding its time. That was the famous slogan of Deng Xiaoping: lie low, maintain a low profile, and bide your time. And the US shows this imperial hubris where they constantly underestimate China's capacities, like they underestimated Russia's capacities. And they're in for but I mean, they were already in for a rude awakening with Russia, but China's at a whole new level. I mean, Russia is a major power, but China's economy is 10 times the size. I mean, their manufacturing capabilities, like what China is able to do, it's just, there's no country that comes even remotely close. So again, hypothetically, all these people in Washington can talk about how they could maybe, if they can't win a war, because all of the war games the Pentagon has done has shown that the US loses, or at the very least, both sides lose. So people in Washington can say, okay, maybe at the very least we can do a lot of damage to China. And even if we don't win a war with China, we can cause all of this damage that will prevent China from, it'll send it 10 years back in development. But even then, it's very risky. And with the possibility of nuclear weapons being used, I mean, this is so reckless. It's really, again, what's happening is so shocking. But when you realize that the people in power are out of touch with reality and don't actually understand China at all, it's less shocking, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's definitely. Well, I wanted to close on this topic to kind of bring it all together. I wanted to talk a little bit about BRICS and Russia, China. You know, we have, of course, Victory Day. By the time some people will have seen this, Victory Day will have come and gone. On May 9th, Putin and Xi Jinping are set to meet. I think Xi Jinping is spending at least 3 days in Moscow, not just for the celebrations, but also to meet with Vladimir Putin. And I wanted to ask KJ, if you're still there, I wanted to begin with the, there's a lot of new reports. Ben talked about Russia, the rude awakening with Russia. Well, Donald Trump came in declaring a war on BRICS. That was the initial, we're going to wage a war on BRICS. But one of the BRICS members, one of the major ones, Russia, he said, well, I want peace. But all of that is turning around as we speak here. Trump's team is preparing options to pressure Russia to end the war. Many of these options include, of course, sanctions. But even though they're saying they want to pressure Russia to end the war, they are continuing to supply Ukraine. The Trump administration is continuing to supply Ukraine, even to the point of sending more air defense systems, which we've talked about, haven't really done much against, let's say, Ansar Allah or Iran, but yet they're going to send more, whatever. I think they're refurbishing, actually, Patriot systems sent to Israel in order to get them to Ukraine. So really no end in sight. J.D. Vance, they're all talking about walking away if this takes too long. But at the same time, could you bring it together, KJ, about this war on BRICS and how, Russia and China are the focal point, but perhaps there's something larger that we can discern and we can talk about with regard to this overall strategy, which not many people are talking about because there's all this confusion about the rhetoric coming from the administration.
Well, BRICS is one of the key counter-hegemonic blocks that is being built out in this new multipolar system. There are other blocks and other alliances as well, but BRICS is very, very important. Let's also note that India is part of BRICS, but again, India has this kind of dual status vis-a-vis the West, because partially in, partially out. When the US originally talked about, the Indo-Pacific strategy, India was supposed to be the left tackle against China, but then it allied or was neutral vis-a-vis, doing trade with Russia. And so India is in the doghouse. But yes, certainly the US wants to take out any counter-hegemonic alliances, and it sees BRICS as one of the key challenges to this continued insane vision of unipolar hegemony, or at least, certain assertion of US unipolar power. I think we have to go back to the essay that Jacques Baud wrote. He's a military strategist. He wrote an essay called The Return of Industrial War. And he pointed out how important industrial power was to military capacity. Essentially, we're living in an age where industrial capacity determines how powerful you are as a military, that there is no substitution for the material production of weapons. And so if we understand that, then we also understand the deep contradiction from the West, because the West, has headed deeply into the financial stage of monopoly capital. It really cannot industrialize. Certainly, there is no meaningful policy to encourage it to do so. But on the other, simply from a kind of a business standpoint, why design, produce, sell, and market a product when you can hire a lawyer to squeeze or sue somebody for rentier profits, or hire an MBA to squeeze the turnip and get blood out of that stone. And so the US really is no longer capable of reindustrializing, not simply because it has deindustrialized, but simply because it has de-skilled its entire workforce. Remember, the process which has been going on for decades has been a continuous process of de-skilling. And so that you no longer have highly skilled workers. Instead, what you have is fungible workers that can be switched out, that are essentially interchangeable resources. And in so doing, you can always discipline labor. This was, the neoliberal agenda, that you want to offshore, but you also want to discipline domestic labor. And one of the ways to do this is to make work completely and totally de-skilled and fungible. Now, having done that, you cannot move back up that chain and reskill, or at least it will take you decades and decades of investment and training and education to do that, which you can see that nobody has even the slightest inkling or understanding that that is necessary. So if we see that entire process going on, that we can also step back and understand that what we're looking at is essentially the long death march of capital. Capitalism is on its deathbed. And we know that in 2008, it had a cardiac arrest. This is why Nicolas Sarkozy, the French president, who was an extreme right-wing conservative hawk, said, laissez-faire, c'est fini. Capitalism is finished. That was in 2008. Well, they put it on the animator, and it's been continuing on, for another, 2 decades. But essentially what happens is, if you will excuse another analogy, capitalism is like your greedy, obese uncle who is constantly going into cardiac fibrillation, who's constantly having a heart attack. And at this point, the aspirin, QE, and all these, macroeconomic levers are no longer working. So you have to get out the wall defibrillator. What is the wall defibrillator? That is world war. And so that is what I'm afraid of, that you see all of this kind of insane escalation, insane rhetoric, insane theorizing, insane threat mongering, insane information warfare. And you say it doesn't make any sense. Of course it doesn't. Yes, fundamentally, these people are insane. But in another sense, I think there is, a cunning which says that they would rather see the end of the world than the end of their power and privilege. And therefore, they're willing to risk everything in order to keep their power and in order to assert continued domination of the global system.
Yeah, Ben, please come right in. I mean, that appears to be, war on BRICS, war on multipolarity, stopping it by any means. That appears to be especially the U.S. agenda as the hegemon. Your reaction to KJ?
Yeah, I agree entirely. KJ put it very well. That's the real danger, is that we can clearly see the decline of U.S. hegemony everywhere we look, economically, politically, even militarily. And the danger is that instead of accepting their decline and a multipolar world in which the U.S. is still going to be a powerful country, but one of many other countries, instead of acknowledging that and accepting that, there are a lot of imperialists in Washington who would prefer a full-on world war to destroy all of their rivals, primarily China, to go back to this era in the 1990s and early 2000s when it was a unipolar world. That's long behind us, and I don't think it's ever coming back, but they would like to make it come back. And if they have to launch a new war and kill who knows how many people, for some of these maniacs in Washington, that's a price they're willing to pay. And it's in their economic interest to do so. That's what's dangerous. It's not just ideological. These are people, look at all these billionaires in the US in the military industrial complex, which is becoming increasingly privatized. The Wall Street Journal published a shocking article in 2024, and the headline is something to the effect of, these are the tech bros who think they can win a war with China. And it talks about how Silicon Valley big tech billionaires have invested more and more in the military industrial complex, in automated weapon systems, in advanced drones and such, and they're all preparing for war on China, and they're all profiting from it. And one of the main people invested in this is the billionaire Peter Thiel, who is very far right, and he has funded a lot of pro-Trump Republicans. He's, of course, a big Trump supporter. And the current U.S. Vice President, J.D. Vance, worked for Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel was his boss. Basically, Thiel created Vance. He created his political career. And J.D. Vance's, Peter Thiel's company is one of the main Pentagon contractors, Palantir. He was the co-founder. And he also, through his venture capital firm, which is called, through venture funds, which is his venture capital firm, Peter Thiel has invested in other Silicon Valley military contractors like Anduril. Anduril is run by this billionaire or founded by this billionaire Palmer Luckey. They're all invested in war on China. And they also all have this very far-right view where they say the West is the best. They're Western supremacists. They don't hide it in any way. And in the case of Peter Thiel, he's openly pro-monopoly. He said this. He wrote an article, an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, in which he said, competition is for losers. It's an exact quote. And he argued that monopolies are good. And they see China as a threat not only to like white Western Judeo-Christian civilization, because many of these people are also Christian extremists, but also because Chinese companies are the only competitors to these US big tech monopolies. This is why the US government has tried to ban Huawei and DeepSeek and even TikTok, any Chinese competitor to US big tech monopolies. So it's not just that these oligarchs who run the US government are deeply committed to overthrowing the Chinese government and they have these very extreme worldview, but it's in their economic interest to do so, because the only way they can continue to maintain these enormous monopoly profits, these rents that are paid to them, is through continued monopolistic control over advanced technologies. So the US doesn't want any other country to be able to develop these advanced technologies, especially artificial intelligence, because right now there's a big race in the US among all these billionaires to see who can be the first one to give a monopoly over AI. So Elon Musk wants the monopoly. Sam Altman wants the monopoly. Microsoft owns 49% of Sam Altman's company, OpenAI, and other big tech oligarchs. They're all competing to get a monopolistic control, not only over the US economy, but really over the entire world. So it's not hyperbolic to say that these US corporations, their goal is really to control the entire world, the entire global economy, and to be these kinds of feudal lords who control everything and suck out rents from everyone else. And, this is KJ was talking about how capitalism is cannibalizing itself. It's on its deathbed. And what we see here is that these big oligarchs in the US, these big capitalists, they're proud of it. They don't even pretend to support free markets and competition. They say monopolies are good, we're monopolists, and China is bad because it's challenging our monopolies.
What you were saying, and I definitely want to bring it back to you, KJ, for any response. It reminded me of, there's this I don't know if I can call him a journalist, Matt Stoller, who always talks about monopolies. We are anti-monopolies, very libertarian, but he's very anti-China. But when I think about China, when I think about BRICS, when I think about even what Russia's doing, a lot of it, even though there's so many differences within BRICS and within the multipolar world economically and politically, one of the things that seems to bind them is this a deep desire to move away from the US's attempt to be a hegemon and to monopolize economically everything, to take everything from them and to essentially make the world in their image, which has for many, many decades, if not centuries, left them, completely out to dry. So KJ, your response to what Ben said and anything you want to put in there.
Well, I absolutely agree with him. These new defense companies that are AI-based, Palantir, Anduril, and a few others, they see AI as the new nuclear weapon. And they believe that whoever gets monopoly control over AI is going to control the world. And certainly they want to control and defeat China using AI. It's a little bit, I refer to it as a digital Wolfowitz doctrine, that they want a kind of digital hegemony over the AI sphere, especially the control of the technology of it. And so you can see that they're maneuvering to do that. And of course, this is not speculation or hypotheticals. We know that Anduril and Palantir are already deeply involved in the genocide against Palestinians in Gaza. They've created multiple programs that are responsible for the tracking, the targeting, the target selection, the logistics that result in these massive attacks on Palestinians. So it's not abstract. It is very real and concrete. And of course, they want to build out entire, a support system, an integrated system that functions a little bit like a, they assert that China has some kind of social credit system. It doesn't. There's no such thing as a social credit system in China. But what they want to do is they want to build out a credit system that tracks everything, this kind of panopticon that tracks everything that you do, and then, which they've already done in Palestine, that tracks everybody, every digital crumb that they leave or don't leave, and then uses that as a basis on which to bomb them or not. So we're heading into this very, very dangerous new world. I guess Aldous Huxley comes to mind. And, when I think of Peter Thiel, he reminds me a little bit like the reanimated corpse of Roy Cohn. But if you stay with Aldous Huxley, Aldous Huxley said, complete damnation is being one's sweating self, but worse. And I think that Peter Thiel, dirtbag tech bro and godfather behind JD Vance that he is, he instantiates that. He's, complete. He signals complete damnation, and he wants to take the rest of us along with him.
Mm. Yeah, indeed. Well, final thoughts for you two, Ben. First, audience members have been asking, where's their hope? Can we end with a little hope? Well, when we talk about BRICS, when we talk about multipolarity, in response to all of what you all have just been detailing, how does that offer hope right now? Because as the Trump administration, as the United States continues to lurch on this trajectory, despite maybe the whims of many who might have supported Donald Trump, there is this accelerating multipolar world that is offering perhaps a hope for the future and even the present. So where does that lie for you, Ben?
Well, yeah, that of course is the hope, that the more that a bully attacks, and the older and fatter and more out of shape the bully gets, the more he expects that other people are not going to fight back. But he's actually getting weaker as other people have been preparing to fight back. And we see this with China. I mean, China has made it very clear. They say constantly, Chinese officials, they do not want war. But if the U.S. is insisting on going down this path, China will defend itself. And the U.S. will not win that war. I mean, China is really serious. They do not want a war. They have not been involved in a war since 1979, unlike the U.S., which is at war every single year, multiple wars every single year. But, the U.S. thinks, again, it constantly underestimates China, just as it underestimated Russia. And it's in for a very rude awakening. So I think I'm quite hopeful. Unfortunately, I'm not hopeful about the U.S. and the West more generally. I don't think it's inevitable that the U.S. and the West goes down this path toward fascism, which is where it's going. But it's going down that path, and the people of these countries, if they can stand up against the oligarchy and pursue a different path, then yeah, I think there could be one toward peace and more equality and better equitable systems that are not just controlled by a small handful of billionaire capitalist oligarchs on Wall Street who control everything. But that's the path the U.S. is going down. But many other countries are pursuing a different path. And of course, China, but not just China. I mean, there are so many countries in the global South that are, the reason that they're interested in BRICS is simply because they want to see a different kind of multipolar world order in which the global South finally can free itself from colonialism. Because as was famously spelled out by Kwame Nkrumah, the founding father of Ghana and one of the co-founders of the non-aligned movement, after the end of formal colonialism, of political colonialism, you had neo-colonialism, as he put it, because economically, the former colonial powers still maintain control over their former colonies. You look at this, for instance, in Africa, where France still maintained effective economic control over many of its former colonies. Well, we've seen revolutionary movements in Burkina Faso, in Niger, in Mali. That revolution is spreading against French neocolonialism. And in Latin America, for decades, we've seen these revolutionary movements. It ebbs and flows. There are times of strength and weakness, but the U.S. thought that it had complete hegemonic control over Latin America, and the region has shown that no, we're going to have independent sovereign governments that will resist U.S. imperialism. and certainly across Africa, certainly across Asia as well. You see many of these movements, of course, China, but not just China. There's so many incredible things happening. And you look at recent polls, for instance, of the ASEAN countries, which has become, ASEAN, Southeast Asia, has become the kind of global hub of economic growth, some of the fastest growing economies in the world. In Vietnam, which is following China's model very successfully. Indonesia is growing very quickly. Malaysia as well. And what we've seen is that there was a poll recently done. Every year there's a poll done of ASEAN asking these countries that if they were forced to pick a side between the US or China, if you only had to pick one, which would you pick? And for the first time, a majority of people in countries in ASEAN now say China, and that's increasing over time. So again, the US thinks that it can drag down the entire world with it. As the Trump administration says, they claim that other countries have no alternative. I mean, this is just Margaret Thatcher's slogan brought back again. There is no alternative. Well, actually, there are alternatives. There are several alternatives being developed. And what we're seeing is increasingly a kind of post-West world. There are people who say that the 21st century will be the Chinese century or the Asian century. I will say the 21st century will be the global South century, the post-West century. And if the Western powers can get over their hegemonic dreams and accept a multipolar world, there's also space for the West in this post-West world, the end of the West as a kind of political construct with a capital W, right? But unfortunately, the political leadership and the capitalist class that dominates, these oligarchs who dominate these governments in the West, they refuse to accept that world, because the only world they ever would want to live in is one where the West is on top and everyone else is a subservient puppet of the West.
Yeah, KJ, your final thoughts before we head out of here.
I absolutely agree with Ben. Hope resides in the global South. We are seeing the end of 500 years of capitalist colonialism. And because of that, we have to continue to work for peace, and we have to keep the global, in the belly of the beast. We have to keep the beast from destroying everything. I think that is our duty. So despair is not an option. Inaction is not an option. And if we do that, then we can see the flourishing of, the global South all over the world. Just one example, Kanaki, New Caledonia, is still fighting back against the French. It's no longer Le Caillou, little playpen for the jet set, but it is resisting, a century and a half of French colonization. I think these movements all over the world, I think these are powerful and inspiring movements that we should all support, even as we prevent the US itself from waging insane, a violent war against the rest of the world.
Yeah, I definitely see that relationship continuing to evolve and escalate too. The United States will become more belligerent, and it will, the dangers of war with Iran, of war with Russia, despite the Trump administration's rhetoric, that war is still going on, and that's not going to stop. China being the big target, and of course all of the wars that are going to surround and occur in and around this overall objective that we're about to see from the national security strategy blatantly lay out. All of it is going to continue to move the world in the opposite direction, and I think that's where the hope is that's going to happen. That's happening as we speak. It's happening in huge ways. It's accelerating. It's getting faster. It seems like each successive administration in the United States is trying to figure out how to manage that crisis, but the more that they do, the more it pushes it further. And the big danger is that, yes, people in the United States have to stop what is going to happen and what is happening in response to this, which is endless wars and the horrific damage that causes to humanity, leading into a possible, as you said, KJ, world war. And I think what many people who watch this program and who watch you both are concerned with, which is nuclear war, which is the United States. This is, I think, a last card it has really to play at this point. But gentlemen, where can people find you guys? I have both of your links in the video description. Ben, your YouTube channel, and KJ to the China Report. But anything else you want to plug, please do, and then we'll head out of here.
Yeah, for me, people can go to geopoliticaleconomy.com, and all the links are there. Thanks for having me, Danny.
And I just did a presentation with a group of people with Friends of Socialist China, International Manifesto Group, on the 50th anniversary of the liberation of Vietnam. And I think that is, again, a powerful and inspiring moment that we can remember and celebrate, even as we continue to gird and move for, the challenges that we will continue to face.
Yes, for sure. All right, well, we'll head out together. Everybody, before you go, hit the like button. That will keep the stream moving in YouTube's algorithm after it is done. If you're new here, subscribe to the channel, of course. Go to the video description where you can find Ben and KJ's links to their, at least their YouTube programs, but you can find their work all over the place. And then go to the video description too. You can support this work on Patreon, Substack, and so many more options. I want to thank everyone who gave a super chat today. I'll just pull you guys up real quick. I want to thank all of you for that. I'll be back very soon with announcements, with more streams. But until then, everybody, take care and have a good rest of your Sunday or early Monday morning or whatever time it is for you. Bye-bye.